Okay, are you, so I'm assuming that you can see the screen and we will, uh, okay, first thing, and again, if there's any problem, please shout, okay? I will be looking at the screen and I don't have the chat visible in front of me. So the best is if you have anything to tell me, then just please shout it out. Again, sorry for today's delay, and I, I was really surprised myself when the computer just stopped working. So again, my apology. The term paper, I hope you're working on it. As not many of you, some of you have indicated to me what you're working on and what you're doing, and I just would encourage you to be finding what it is that something that you has inspired you, something that you yourself have been impressed by, what you should be doing, and that is identifying other sources that sort of back up, because the important point that we're making here is that how do you really assess the role of something, the function of something, the value of something? Well, where do you see support for how that work that you have chosen is indeed valued in the community, valued for its role as a kind of verbal art? So as has been mentioned before, this will be due on Friday, the 23rd of April, and that will be the end of the review week. And what you should be identifying is an example of verbal art. And there's a range of possibilities as far as what you could identify. And you should be asking yourself these questions. How is it an example of extended metaphor involving what we have called symbolic articulation? How it articulates a symbol, a metaphor, and that the text itself is has this metaphorical value. It's not in the specific words, it's not even in specific grammatical categories, but the metaphor is what extends across the text in terms of the patterning that you identify. And then how does language and metaphor contribute to the positive evaluation of your selected example? Where is the aesthetic appeal in terms of what you have chosen? And this is a very important point. You will need to cite sources to support your claim that this indeed is value. This, what you identified, what you have chosen to do your term paper on, is indeed an example of verbal art and regarded as such within the community, within the users, the speakers of the language. All right, so this is we've looked at this already. So today, just to go over a few of the points that were made in terms of commencement speeches. And we identified two commencement speeches that were, and this is the kind of thing I mean when I say identify a piece that is a text that is valued within the community. So when I look at these speeches of David Foster Wallace or Steve Jobs, Time magazine identify them as among the top 10 commencement speeches. So there obviously is support for considering these to be examples of valued, highly valued works that, and the question I guess would be do they, besides the fact that they are a commencement speech that motivates graduates, is there perhaps more to how that speech is put together that gives it not only that function of motivating graduates to improve, but also an aesthetic element to it. And so we looked at Steve Jobs as an example. All right. So, and looking at Steve Jobs then in terms of his commencement speech that he gave at Stanford. And we noticed that there were certain, yes, there were certain ways in which that speech was crafted, it was designed. There were elements that we could say were truly aesthetic about how that text was put together, the rule of three. And it's not just a few occurrences, it goes throughout the text. These references to things in threes. Of course, yes, we see it in other speeches as well. It's a common rhetorical device. We've seen it in Obama's. We even saw it in Trump's speech to Congress. But there's another element too here as well besides that, and that is the use of, some would say antithesis, some say antithesis, where you have a juxtaposition of opposites, dropped out, dropped in, looking forward, looking backwards, the heaviness, the lightness, death and life, old and new. These contrasts that, again, throughout the text. And so in looking at this commencement speech, we noticed that there were three stories of his life. And that's typical of commencement speeches. It's as we said, it's someone who is famous, successful, and who is now communicating to these graduates what was sort of key to their success and how it made them successful, and perhaps passing that along to the graduates. And we found is very, very first person. And we noticed, though, that first person element, the I as sort of the initiator of the doing, in story one, dropping out of school, going to classes that he liked, there he was more in control. In story two, he is less in control. He's been fired, and he's least in control. 14% I as the initiator in the story three, which was about death. Other elements that we noticed about the speech in terms of the use of simple versus complex clauses, and the use of what we've talked about as parataxis and hypotaxis, two concepts which I hope you're quite clear on in terms of what they mean. Here's a video I'd like you to look at.
It's 1,000 songs in your pocket. The iPod.
If I had never dropped out, I would have never dropped in on that calligraphy class, and personal computers might not have the wonderful typography that they do. Of course, it was impossible to connect the dots looking forward when I was in college, but it was very, very clear looking backwards 10 years later. Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. Because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart, even when it leads you off the well-worn path. And that will make all the difference. I was lucky. I found what I loved to do early in life, when I was 20. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything. I'm convinced that the only thing that kept me going was that I loved what I did. You've got to find what you love, and that is as true for work as it is for your lovers. Your work is going to fill a large part of your life, and the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking, and don't settle. As with all matters of the heart, you'll know when you find it. And like any great relationship, it just gets better and better as the years roll on. So keep looking. Don't settle. When I was 17, I read a quote that went something like, "If you live each day as if it was your last, someday you'll most certainly be right." It made an impression on me, and since then, for the past 33 years, I've looked in the mirror every morning and asked myself, if today were the last day of my life, would I want to do what I am about to do today? And whenever the answer has been no for too many days in a row, I know I need to change something. Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart. No one wants to die.
We gotta risk everything. Great artists, Dylan, Picasso, Newton, they risk failure. And if we want to be great, we gotta risk it too.
Even people who want to go to heaven don't want to die to get there. And yet, death is the destination we all share. No one has ever escaped it. And that is as it should be, because death is very likely the single best invention of life. It's life's change agent. It clears out the old to make way for the new. Right now, the new is you. But someday, not too long from now, you will truly become the old and be cleared away. Sorry to be so dramatic, but it's quite true. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary. Were the words, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." It was their farewell message as they signed off. Stay hungry, stay foolish. And I have always wished that for myself.
Because people will never stop believing that they can get more out of something. Whether it be their jobs, their marriage, their money, their lives. It's the belief in the limitless, the impossible. That no matter what you dream, you can do it.
When you grow up, you tend to get told the world is the way that it is. Your life is just to live your life inside the world and try not to bash into the walls too much. That's a very limited life. Life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact, and that is that everything around you that you call life was made up by people that are no smarter than you. And you can change it. You can influence it. You can build your own things that other people can use. It's to shake off this erroneous notion that life is just there and you're just gonna live in it versus embrace it, change it, improve it, make your mark upon it. And once you learn that, you'll never be the same again. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
And now, as you graduate to begin anew, I wish that for you. Stay hungry, stay foolish. Thank you all very much.
I'm very happy to be here today with you all. And as some of you may know, about 5 months ago, I had a liver transplant. So I now have the liver of a mid-20s person who died in a car crash and was generous enough to donate their organs. And I wouldn't be here without such generosity. So I hope all of us can be as generous and elect to become organ donors. I'd like to take a moment and thank everybody in the Apple community for the heartfelt support I got, too. It really meant a lot. And I'd also like to especially thank Tim Cook and the entire executive team of Apple. They really rose to the occasion and ran the company very ably in that difficult period. So thank you, guys. Let's give them a round of applause. So, I'm vertical. I'm back at Apple, loving every day of it. And I'm getting to work with our incredibly talented teams to come up with some great new products for you all in the future. So it's wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, when we look at that speech, there are the elements that, yes, we find in other sort of motivation speeches. There is something special about it. The speech, as we can see, is taken over and then put into a video and expanded on with respect to his life. So the speech itself becomes itself a kind of, as we've been saying, an extended metaphor of his life. Now, we looked at Denzel Washington's sort of, again, a video compilation of various speeches that he has given at commencement, as commencement addresses. And we identified about 9 various characteristics of texts of this nature. The use of short, fragmented sentences. Fragments mean they're not really even complete sentences, okay? A lot of first-person reference. Second-person reference, yes. And remember when we looked at Steve Jobs' commencement speech, every story came round to you, came round to those imperatives, telling people what they should be doing. Highly paratactic, joining, expanding the ideas in the text through parataxis, a symmetrical, a sequence of ideas. The use of mental processes. It's about thinking. It's about how one thinks. It's about how one sees the world. Illustrating with examples from one's life or other stories. Questions, rhetorical questions. Repetition. These features we've identified in terms of commencement speeches. We see them in, again, also in the speech by Steve Jobs. You'll remember in the first, I think it was in the first lecture, we were looking at comparing a commencement speech by Susan Rice with a speech that was given by Donald Jung. And remember at the time we noticed how Susan Rice's speech, there was a lot of doing. And who were the doers? We identified the doers as people. I, herself, first person, we, you. It was about people taking control of their lives and making changes. And that came through then in the choices that she made, in contrast with what we saw with Donald Jung. In his speech, there was a lot. There was doing. Yes, there were actions, but those actions were being carried out by institutions, by not by people. Institutions, abstractions, organizations, history. This is one aspect of what we've looked at, and what I want you to be thinking about over what we've been looking at over the semester. This course is not just about sort of giving you inspirational speeches, speeches that move people, motivate people. That's part of it. It's part of, yes, the attraction and the what these accomplish, but it's also trying to understand what there was in the language. That these are what we appreciate in a text is really appreciating the role of language. And when we say that Susan Rice, it's mainly getting across this message about that we are taking control of our lives and we are responsible for making change in our lives. And she gets that point across, and it gets across by the fact of it's the doing is being done, as we said, by people. And so we could even sort of quantify this so that we identify the doing and found 80% is by I, you, and we. And half the speech is about doing. So those are choices that are being made. And why, when we say that language is about making meaning, how do you make meaning? By the choices that you make. And that's why at the very outset of the semester, I wanted you to appreciate the fact that this choice of 80% I, you, and we, that's her choice. It wasn't Donald Jung's choice. And what their choices reflect is the way they construe the world. So what I want you to be able to appreciate in a text is what's going on in the language.
So much change has transpired just in my adult lifetime, and you will see so much more in yours. But it doesn't just happen. Progress is the product of human agency. Things get better because we make them better. And things go wrong when we get too comfortable, when we fail to take risks or seize opportunities. Never trust that the abstract forces of history will end a war, or that luck will cure a disease, or that prayers alone will save a child. If you want change, you have to make it. If we want progress, we have to drive it.
All right, so the contrast that we made, my point being that contrast is in terms of choices made in the language about how you will see the world, how you will construe what's going on in the world, and who's doing it. Now, this is the closing of Susan Rice, her speech, all right? The bit we listened to before, but this you haven't heard. Now, this is the closing. Now, what do you notice about this particular, the closing of this particular speech? What do you notice perhaps about her, again, the choices that she's making in language?
And finally, as you're changing the world, never neglect family. They're not just your foundation. They're the source of life's greatest fulfillment, as all the parents here can testify. Both my parents were recently struck by serious illnesses. My colleagues were tremendous about stepping in for me at the halls of the United Nations. But nobody could step in for me or my brother at the hospital. There's usually someone else who can do your job, but there's nobody else who can be a loving child or a devoted parent. Like those before you, your generation will contribute. It will innovate, and it will serve in unique ways. But today, change is coming faster than ever, and you must shape that change. You can be that change, not for an election, but for a lifetime. If you remember nothing else of what I said, try to remember that little boy. Remember that he is somebody's beloved son. Remember that he counts as much as any of us. Remember that we cannot afford to sleep easy while he suffers. Remember that you can make his life better. Above all, remember that each of us has a profound responsibility to try, with all of our skill, all of our smarts, and all of our soul. So make him safe, make progress, and make us proud. Congratulations again, and Godspeed.
Okay, now come back. What elements do you see here that are like what you've seen in other commencement speeches? You see the first person story about her parents. She makes it personal. But do you notice the direction that she's going? It's not about herself. As she moves on and as she comes to the closing, it's about you. It's about, do you notice how many imperatives there are? Remember, remember, remember. These are imperatives, these are commands, these are being addressed. And obviously remember that is what we see in Steve Jobs. It's what we see in Denzel Washington. It's making it interpersonal. It's addressing it to their audience, expecting from their audience it's not just an appreciation of their story, but actions to be taken. Now, when you're leading up to something like that, that is what is a true motivational speech. A true motivational speech is supposed to give you the desire to take action. And so it's not uncommon for there to be imperatives here, because those are the actions that are being, hopefully, that this speech is motivating you to take. Now, if I go through and look at the process types again, the material processes, the mental processes, and just here in this brief part, again, you'll notice that I is not very much. It's mainly about you, but you notice a lot of other, right? So, but do I get the full picture here? You in an imperative. Remember, remember, remember. You isn't mentioned, is it? But it's understood. It's inferred. When you say an imperative, close the door, remember, make this happen, these kinds of, this use of language doesn't mention you, but it's understood. And if I add those up, you'll see that what happens, you is primarily what this text is about, you. All right, so we have been looking at commencement speeches. They're motivational speeches. They're meant to inspire. And we've looked at what we would characterize as being typical commencement speeches. What we would expect to be sort of the, and if you invite someone to come and give a commencement address, these are the features one would expect. But then we noticed that there was this David Foster Wallace, this postmodern American novelist. And I've mentioned him before, and we've played again parts of his address. And today we'll look at more fully that address that he gave. But again, he was identified by Time magazine, but there was sort of a, well, let me read it again. This address, this is Time magazine's response, right? I mean, they put him at the top of their top 10 list. But there's something a bit unusual about this particular speech. This address at Kenyon, that was the college where David Foster Wallace gave the speech, was vintage Wallace. Vintage means what? Typical. What we would expect. It's a smart, occasionally meandering discussion of the issues that consumed him, from the banality of life to the meaning of consciousness. Then they quote him. I know that this stuff probably doesn't sound fun, breezy, and grandly inspirational. That's what he said. I mean, you're supposed to be delivering an address that is, that makes people feel good, that is supposed to be inspirational. But he's saying this stuff that he's talking about isn't. What it is, again, they're quoting David Foster Wallace, as so far as I can see it, is the truth. The capital T truth is about life before death. It is about making it to 30 or maybe 50 without wanting to shoot yourself in the head. What a thing to say in a commencement address to these graduates. Time magazine, remember, they go on to say all the reasons Wallace didn't make it to 50 are apparent here. In hindsight, the speech reads like the first draft of a suicide note for an author who took his own life last year at age 46. The speech reads like the first draft of a suicide note. Wow, that is not grandly inspirational. It is a macabre read. There's tons that's worthwhile here. The speech crackles with wit and intelligence and offers tricks for escaping the depression to which Wallace ultimately succumbed. And as I've explained before, I mean, the history behind his suicide was that since, and some of you might remember me telling you, and since university, he did go through depression. And he was under medication. He produced this work that was so well received, Infinite Jest. And he's trying desperately to write another novel that will be just as great. But he's having difficulty. He cannot seem to create. Something holding him back. He thinks it's his medication. He goes off his medication and he committed suicide. He was considered to be one of these up-and-coming writers. Newsweek magazine featured him on their cover. The book Infinite Jest itself includes so many references to suicide.
Greetings, thanks.
Now, I have a video that I want to show you, but I'm I want to do that after we take a break. So let's take a break, and then when we come back, we'll continue. All right. So let's take a break now. Let me see. The time is 12:50. So let's come back at 1 o'clock. All right. See you back here at 1 o'clock. Thank you. Not just the sequencing of ideas, but how those ideas are understood. But it's different, right? It's not like Steve Jobs or Susan Rice or Denzel Washington. It's very different. And that's why we called it the anti-text. It's an alternative way of speaking. It's not at all, no, grandly inspirational, but it does make you think. It makes you think. This is water. That metaphor itself expresses the ideas of what he's trying to get across. That how we see the world, we have a sort of the automatic sort of the default way of seeing the world and understanding what's going on around us. But there's another way to see it, perhaps a more kinder, gentler, more positive way to see what's happening. And so in a way, yes, it does motivate us, but it motivate us not to an action, but to thinking. And why I really like this speech is because, in a way, as I'm mentioning, it's the anti-text. And what does that mean? The anti-text. I've given you this quote before. Halliday talks about anti-language. What's an anti-language? He says arises when the alternative reality is a counter reality. That is what David Foster Wallace is trying to present, a counter reality. Counter to the way we normally see the world, set up in opposition to some established norm. The whole principle of what he's trying to communicate is this counter reality, establishing the fact that the way we see the world, our default, is that we are the center of the world. It is thus not the distance between the two realities, but the tension between them that is significant. The distance need not be very great. The one is, in fact, a metaphorical variant of the other. So this is a metaphorical variant. The whole text, the whole commencement speech is presented in such a way as that it is an anti-text to get you to realize that what he's asking you to do is to think in a completely different way about your world. It is an anti-commencement speech. It isn't filled with those, it isn't like the stories of his life. In fact, he talks about very mundane, very routine things. But that's again part of what he's communicating. It isn't really his style. I mean, it's very easy to understand what he's saying. It's very, as has been described, lucid. Very easy very easy to follow exactly what he's saying. Whereas his typical style is to be very opaque, not to be so transparent in what he's trying to communicate. He's advocating for a counter reality through a way of speaking, a way of presenting that is counter to our expectations. So he comes back and says that is real freedom. That's how he concludes. That is being educated, understanding how to think the alternative. What's the alternative? Unconsciousness, the default setting, the rat race, the constant gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing. His question, what the hell is water? A sensitivity to what is going on around us. That there is, in fact, what we're looking at is, and what we're perceiving, what we're construing is the automatic. And so what he's actually talking about is the need to de-automatize. You've heard me talk about that a lot. De-automatize. The metaphor, the metaphorical. It's key to innovation. It's key to creativity. The key to innovation in verbal science. The ability to have the idea of grammatical metaphor, that when you have a process, it need not be represented as a verb. You can do it as a noun. It is de-automatization. It is a metaphor. Anything where you're talking about a de-automatization, something which is counter to how the default, to what the default is, that is the metaphor. That is not the literal, is not the congruent, not the straightforward, not the default. But that's what we see in verbal science. It's what we see in verbal art. It is the basis of creativity in verbal art. How? You've looked at this. We've seen this in terms of poetry and in terms of creating a background where what the artist is doing is actually creating a background against which to foreground. It would be as if Donald Jung, in giving his speech, talking how mainly it's done by events and by abstractions and by things. If all of a sudden what he did was foreground and it was I, you, we, breaking out of that perception and coming out with what is an alternative, that would have been foregrounded. But that's not the way he thinks. He's thinking in that mode of thinking that is related to the idea that we are not in control. That's basically his message. So this key to the innovation in verbal science, this key to creativity in verbal art, it's the ability to recognize, to create the automatic. You see what David Foster Wallace is saying, recognize that this is the automatic. This is water. And when you do so, you can realize that there's other things. There's something outside. That ability to de-automatize is the basis for innovation, the basis for creativity. And if anything, that's what I hope you will take away from this course, the realization that truly to be able to innovate in language, in thinking, is this ability to recognize this is water. And to be able to go beyond that to de-automatize. Now, what the verbal artist does is, in fact, create an automatic within their text against which then to foreground.
The meta functions.
We've looked at the meta functions and the ideational, the interpersonal, the textual. Language is a means of making meaning, the choices that we make. The key what I've been trying to present over this last semester is when it comes to talking about language and art, invention, inspirations, has not just been to play for you videos of inspirational speeches, and not just to hear speeches and say, yes, this is inspirational, but it's to realize what is there that indeed makes art art, what makes it inspirational, what makes it creative. And that is going to be discovered in the resource that is the basis for our ability to communicate, language. Thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically. We're talking about and when I talk about thinking grammatically, by now, I hope this is so clear. On the one hand, you have meaning. On the other hand, you have the wording. And when Halliday says, thinking about meaning is thinking grammatically, it's thinking about meaning means thinking about the wording. And by the wording, what we're talking about is how the words combine to express meaning, how the choices that you're making, what kind of process, is it doing, is it sensing, is it behaving, is it saying, what kind of process, who initiates, who is affected by it, what are the circumstances. When it comes to the idea that we don't just speak in little short, like when you're watching a movie and you see the subtitles at the bottom. No, we talk in extended texts. And these extended texts, we are expanding our ideas. How do we expand our ideas? The logic behind the expansion. Is it just a sequence, one idea, one right after the other, extending it like that? Or is it developing ideas so that we have a main idea about which we elaborate something, about which we try to enhance it with some other, not a complete sentence, but what we call a dependent clause, the logical. How do we get across our roles? Now, interpersonal meaning really comes through in those commencement speeches. What is the role of the speaker and the hearer? Do you notice that it's in David Foster Wallace, there aren't a lot of you. Yeah, but not imperatives. Not, as he says, I'm not telling you how to think. But what he's trying to do is to make you think in a particular way by making you realize how we so often see the world. He tries to set up that contrast so that you realize this, what he's talking about is this capital T truth. You have a choice. What's the attitude of the speaker? How is the message organized? How is it put together? How does it come together as a text? These are all aspects. When we've talked about how the message is organized, we've talked about how do you begin each of those clauses. You see, the orientation of this course is linguistics, right? Because what we're saying is that if you want to talk about what it means to inspire, what it means to be creative, that is going to be discovered through the language. And what better way than you need a means to be able to get at the wording. Now, I want to turn our attention to something rather practical. Since the whole orientation has been looking at meaning and looking at grammar, what I've displayed on the screen is it's a rubric that can be applied. You see, we ran a program here at CityU to help students learn to write better. And how we did that was that we realized that when students have difficulty with writing and so forth, you can send them to the Language Center, and they can learn about grammar. But the point that we realized was that, in fact, students like yourselves are writing in English for their coursework. And now, that should also be a learning experience. The writing that you do, no matter what subject area you're in, whether it's law, or it's engineering, or linguistics, or whatever other subject you are working in, and you're writing in English, now that itself should be a learning experience. So what we did was we arranged for there to be online coaches, like mentors. And who were these mentors? They were PhD students in applied linguistics. And some of them were from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Some were from the University of Sydney in Australia. Some of them were from universities in the States. And they were themselves studying how to be teachers of language. And so they were our online coaches. And a student would write up something for their coursework, and they could put this draft online, and the coach would discuss with them and help them. Now, what was it that the coach was going to give them advice about? Now, that's what's laid out here in this, what's called the SLATE rubric, Scaffolding Literacy in Academic and Tertiary Environment. See, the point being that when we come to our use of language, what is it that we need to pay attention to? Now, hopefully over the course of this semester, you've been realizing the kinds of things we've been talking about, like the kinds of meaning and the kinds of wording. Now, take that and apply that to writing in an academic or tertiary environment. The whole point was that the idea was to make students as writers, like yourselves, grammatically aware. What does that mean, to be grammatically aware? Now, just take a look, if you will, at this, what's on your screen. You can see that it's a 3x3 matrix, right? Now, what are the dimensions of this 3x3 matrix? In this case, let's look at the columns. And the first column, you'll notice, says it goes to what we would call genre, register, the kind of writing, like writing for science, or writing for this discipline, writing for law, writing for business. And so what is the social activity? What is the activity that one is engaged in? Which discipline is one writing for? That will be one dimension. And the second would be the semantics, the meaning. And the third would be how then that will sort of translate into choices in the grammar. Remember, thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically. So how is this grammaticality realized? What is accomplished through the lexicogrammar? Now come back to the semantics, meaning. And that we've looked at, we've said ideational, interpersonal, textual. Now, notice that is what's the rows. We have ideational meaning, interpersonal meaning, textual meaning. Now that's our 3x3 matrix. So what I'd like you to be taking away is that sort of the way we're seeing language in context. We're seeing meaning, language as meaning. We're seeing language as how meaning is realized in the grammar. And it is realizing meaning in terms of ideational, interpersonal, and textual meaning. We are bringing, that's the whole platform that we've been bringing to look at texts that we've been describing as language of art, invention, and inspiration. And so what does it mean then to be grammatically aware? Let me give you some examples, all right? Now, when you think about, now let's put it in the sense of not thinking about meaning and wording of someone else's text, like some commencement speech or something like that. Let's apply that to your writing. Your writing for school. Let's bring it down to something very practical. First of all, what we have to realize that there are elements within what you're talking about that refer to things. What occurs in noun groups, noun phrases. And these will be described very often in very specialized terms and with adjectives that describe and classify and post-modifying defining clauses. But what it means is that you will have participants. Understand language in terms of every clause has participants, and every clause has perhaps something about the circumstances. These would be the prepositional phrases, the location, time, place, and so on. But core to the whole idea is the process. The process, the verb. That is so central to what it is that is being said. And that's why when we've been looking at speeches like Donald Jung and Susan Rice, we looked at it in terms of this process, participant, circumstance. Understanding one's writing in terms of what kinds of processes are you using? Who are the initiators? Who is the affected, right? And so we take this example from an academic text. It begins, the above opening sentence from Kafka's novella introduces what has become one of the world's greatest works of literary art. And what we see right away when we look at that is that it's a long sentence, what we've described as being lexically dense. Now, we looked at that when we looked, for example, at David Foster Wallace's speaking. We also looked at that when we were looking at the language of that in the court. And the judge, when he was summing up the evidence. When he was summing up the evidence, remember what we noticed was very lexically dense. Simple clauses. Now, this is basically a simple clause. Is one verb. That's it. But what makes it so complicated sounding is the fact that you have packed so much information into the noun phrase. The above opening sentence from Kafka's novella. All right, so you have the above opening modifying sentence, and then a post-modification with a prepositional phrase from Kafka's novella. The verb introduces, and then you take a nominalized clause, basically a whole clause, which you have turned into what is essentially behaving like a noun. What has become one of the world's greatest works of literary art. Now, that itself has a verb inside of it. Yes, what has become, but it is packed into this clause, which has been basically turned into a nominalized clause, meaning it's turned into like a noun phrase. It has the same role grammatically within this sentence as if it were just a noun. Now, this is what we've been calling grammatical metaphor. You can even take what is a clause and turn it into basically something. And that is very much characteristic of how one writes in an academic setting. We have classifying adjectives, we have defining clauses. Now, take this sentence. It speaks to the inner sense of struggle shared by all who live and work in modern society. Now, that is made up of several clauses. It speaks to the sense of struggle, which is shared by all who live and work in modern society. All of these post-modifying clauses, we call them defining clauses. And in fact, they are a kind of almost nominalization itself, because the whole thing is, what is the head? This speaks to the inner sense of struggle. This idea of struggle, which is shared by all. And then embedded within that, who live and work in modern society. Two relative clauses, post-modifying the inner sense of struggle. Now that's the nature of participants. Lexically dense. This is in the kind of academic writing that we're talking about. So when we say thinking grammatically, we're talking about thinking about who are the participants? What is the process? What are the circumstances? Now, let me take an example to illustrate why one has to think about this. And let's just take this sentence here. It's not a well-formed sentence. Why isn't it? Some people think that from the impact of the recent forecasts of climate change will reduce the impact of a warrant to wild animals, and planning for mitigation is prudent now. Some people think that from the impact of the recent forecast of climate change, I ask you to think about this sentence in terms of process, participant, circumstance. Well, first of all, think about the process. Think. Rarely used in academic writing. Not to say that we don't think, but we don't make it so subjective. Now notice, what is the grammatical subject? The grammatical subject is a prepositional phrase. From the impact of the recent forecast of climate change. That is a circumstance. A circumstance cannot be the grammatical subject. The main clause is a mental process in which the censor is indefinite. Some people, that would be also, I mean, who is thinking? Some people. Now that's, again, when you're talking about an academic writing, you don't mean just so indefinite. Some people, who? You cannot leave it so vague as that. And the word warrant here, well, I have no idea what was being meant here. There are aspects to be thinking about in terms of process, the kind of participants, and what is the role of circumstances. Now, another way to write that sentence would be this: planning for mitigation against the possible negative impact of climate change on the well-being of wild animals. Now, notice that is just the grammatical subject by itself. Notice how much has been packed into that noun phrase. Planning for mitigation against, in fact, it is a clause, an ing verb, planning, but it has been nominalized into what we basically consider like a noun group, a noun phrase, which functions as the grammatical subject. Is considered, that's the main verb, prudent by some. And then in an academic text, of course, you'd give references. Who are the some? You cannot just leave it vague. Okay, I think it's about time. It's 1:52. Let's take a break for about 10 minutes. Now, what I'm trying to go through with you in this sort of closing for week 12 is the idea that take this grammatical awareness. You should be seeing it in terms of looking at your appreciation of language and art, invention, inspiration. But I want you to also see it in terms of an application to your own writing, your own use of language. So when we come back, we'll talk about textual meanings and how this is realized in the grammar. So let's take a, if we can, at 1:53, just let's come back a little bit after 2 o'clock, okay? So let's take a break. Okay, we're back, and what we're looking at is a way to think about language in sort of a 3-by-3 matrix. It is sort of how we have been looking at language in art, invention, inspiration. It is the framework that we have been applying, but what I'm saying to you now is that it is something you can apply to any use of language, including how one deals with academic texts. This whole idea of being grammatically aware means so much more than just being sort of aware of subject-verb agreement, or the correct use of tense, or how to use a participle clause. That's grammar, but there's much more to the notion of being grammatically aware. It's a being aware of how the words that we use and the wordings that we use, the ways that we use language, shape what we are wanting to say, but they are also shaped by the context in which they occur. So let's take a look at this lower box in the right-hand corner, and it's dealing with what we call textual meaning in terms of grammar. One of those aspects that we've mentioned has been theme. This idea of theme, not in the sense that we use it for when we're talking about literature, not in the sense that Professor Ruqaiya Hasan talked about it in terms of theme being a hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social men. Here, we're saying that how you began each clause, the beginning is a choice. And that choice may be what we would call the unmarked, sort of the default choice. Now, that would be the grammatical subject, typically, if you're making a statement. But could you put something else into that position? Yes. And doing so is, in a way, giving an idea to the person about how the text is gradually unfolding. When you talk about theme, what is it? It's the starting point of each message being a clause. It's what the speaker wants to talk about. It orients what is going to be said here within the context of what else has been said. They relate to the method of development of the text. Now, I introduced this before. Theme, it's what occurs at the beginning. It can be John's already left, grammatical subject. You could put the circumstance there, yesterday. You could even put the complement there, his spirit. And in fact, it can be the grammatical subject may embed a clause within it, like this, people who live in glass houses. And as the text unfolds, these choices indicate something about how the information is being conveyed. So in the sense that the genesis of the City Polytechnic of Hong Kong lay in the report of a committee. That report of the committee, that was what we put toward the end of the clause, what we put later on, not at the beginning, later on, it's the new information. But notice how that new information then is picked up in the next clause as the way to begin it. And that is because there is this flow of information. How we end one clause is typically how we begin the next. The new becomes the old information. This we call linear thematic progression, but we also can just simply keep repeating the same thing as theme. I noticed that I was not sharing the screen. All right, now I think we are back to sharing the screen. All right, so let me just make sure that that is fixed. All right, so let me just quickly back up a bit. What we talked about here in the sense of the lower right-hand corner, to make it easier for you to see. The first item, as I mentioned, is theme. And the unmarked theme, as I said, the grammatical subject. What is theme? It is the starting point of the message. It's what the speaker wants to talk about. It may be the grammatical subject, it may be the reference to the circumstance yesterday, may be the complement, may be an embedded clause within as a post modifier of the subject. And we talked about, and I mentioned just now, this flow of information, what occurs toward the end of the clause becoming how we begin the next clause, this linear thematic progression, or repeating the same thing as theme throughout. Another aspect of textual meaning then is this use of grammatical metaphor, because very often in the language of science, what has already been described as in sort of usual verbal terms, the actions that take place, what was done in the experiment, perhaps that step, but the outcome, the result, now that will be repackaging what was that happening into a something which would very often be how you would begin the next clause. So we talked about what is grammatical metaphor, and the idea being that they educated girls. This is sort of the verbal way of speaking. And then the conjunction, women acquire the vote, and changing that two clauses into one clause, where what was expressed before as a verb now is expressed as a noun. This
So
shift,
grammatical metaphor
yes,
involves a shift sideways. Classes like verbs and adjectives become nouns.
there is this shift. It's a shift, as we can see. It's sideways. The verbs, the adjectives, they become nouns. Conjunctions become verbs. The idea that you have more than one clause now becomes a simple clause. We developed a software in a project here that was designed to help students be able to develop this ability to be able to produce nominalizations. This software is called Formal Writer. And it was identifying perhaps within a student's writing certain words that might be considered more informal language, and suggesting to the writer what might be possible other ways to express that less formal writing into a more formal writing. And another element was what we call the nominalizer, that took a particular, for example here, their education of girls caused the acquisition of the vote by women. Now, that is a suggested by computer to the student who wrote, They educated girls so women acquired the vote. Now, there are three suggestions here from this software that was developed to give students alternatives, aware that besides the just sort of the congruent, the default, the automatic way of usually talking about things, where the verb, where the process is a verb, instead changing that into the way that is normally used in academic writing, involving grammatical metaphor, involving nominalization. Now, this idea of theme, this is in fact a student's writing. And what this student illustrated was their reasoning behind the choices that they made as far as what they indicated to be theme. Now, on the left side of your screen is what the student wrote. What the student wrote was this: it is well recognized that the society is fundamental to social life, as it provides a sustainable environment for the establishment of social activities. Now, what the student, in thinking about and in talking about, explaining the choices that the student made in terms of what was theme, the student wrote this. This is the explanation. This is the rationale. 1A employs a cleft construction where the grammatical subject, 1B, receives focus in order to highlight the new argument about the society. And so the 1B, it is that the society is fundamental to social life. This receives the, as he explains, the focus. 1C justifies 1A as indicated by the textual theme as, the use of conjunction. Then as it continues, also the society becomes thematic in 1C, it. So what was mentioned before, the society, now is referred to by it. That is a kind of linear thematic progression. The point is to be able to think about the choices that you're making with respect to the language. Why do you choose to begin that sentence, that clause, the way you do? It has meaning. It has significance. It is a choice. So the point that I'm trying to get across then is when you're writing, it matters to your listener because your listener is, or your reader, is paying attention to the choices you're making for what you put first. Whether you are going to have sort of, as we called it, a linear thematic progression or continuous thematic progression, those choices that you're making are going to affect the reader's ability to follow the flow of information. The use of grammatical metaphor allows you to take what has been said previously and repackage it as a noun, which you then can put as the subject of what follows, so that the reader is able to follow what it is that you're talking about, what you're saying. Another aspect comes to looking at the context and how what's our purpose? What is the purpose of one's writing? How do you you're writing in a particular area, particular discipline? How does that technical knowledge expressed through language? There's also there also in terms of how when you think about the way the information is phased, how it is extended across, how the information within your text occurs as phases across the text. Now that comes to what we've been talking about before as the architecture of the text, how the text becomes coherent, that a text consists of functionally significant parts. There is a unity to the parts and it derives from the writer's intention. This is the second point. Writing with intention. The writing should be intentional. You're grammatically aware. At the same time, you're also intentional. How your ideas are being developed across the text. The idea in terms of how a text is built up as parts into larger and ever larger up until the text as a whole. It's hierarchical. And the relations then that occur between the parts that occur in a text. And these can be asymmetrical. Some are more core, some are more peripheral. The idea of parataxis, hypotaxis, which we've explained and which we've looked at, but an awareness of how that develops within the text. And the example that I gave you is in looking at Obama's text and this speech that he gave and how he concluded that speech. And there was a structure to it. There was an architecture to it. As we take, as we learn, this repetition, it's not just a repetition. There is behind it, we can map out what that structure was as we take, as we learn. That pair, that's paratactic. As we learn, there's another pair, that the struggle, that the hopes. Now, all of that is forming sort of like a dependent idea as we take, as we learn. It means as you're doing something, well, what's the core then? What's the main idea? Main idea, we will remember, we will begin it. All in, notice the pairing. But then we end up with that triplet, that thing in threes, that there is something, that we are not as divided, that we are one people, that we are one nation. The last of those triplets being itself a pair. There was a design to it, very intentional. That intention is something that we can see mapped into the architecture of the text. It's what gave it, as we saw, that it almost gave it a rhythm. It gave it a tempo. It almost was music, because it wasn't just pairs, but it was the way in which these pairs then were, in a way, organized into the text as a whole. When we looked at the spoken word performance of Brandon Leake, we again noticed there was an architecture to the poem. We could map out the spoken word performance. And what we noticed was that it was largely, now we notice a few arcs here, but largely it was paratactic. It was ideas that were presented, balanced, symmetrical. But we noticed also that when it got to the middle of the text, and but, in the beginning of sentence 11, that marked a contrast. It marked sort of the boundary between the beginning, where he talks about his sister and himself, but when his sister died. It marked a turning point in the text. Now, what happened was also another thing that we noticed, and this is the part where we're thinking grammatically, this shift, there is an architecture in this text. And now that expression of but, what does it express? Yes, this was the contrast. This was life before. This is life after. It is a rather paratactic. It is opposites. It's in contrast. Now, what's the contrast? How does that contrast come through grammatically? Notice the shift. Whereas everything is in active voice before, it changes now to passive voice. Then ground bound. I was left. I was haunted. What is that saying? He is no longer the one in control. He's no longer initiating. He is the one now affected. The change was not just but thereafter there is a change in terms of what happened to him. She left and he was left. The change from active to passive. We noticed what was the lexically dense, that one sentence, sentence 13, in which it becomes so many clauses strung together within this one sentence. It becomes so lexically dense. It stands out against the rest of the text. There's so much going on in that sentence 13. Greater clausal complexity, a sharp peak in lexical density, but not only that, the speed with which he was speaking. Suddenly, in this sentence, up to almost 200 words per minute. The speed then falls back. There's a build-up within the text. Again, you can see sort of the architecture of the text as it builds in terms of speed, where it gets up to that point of sentence 13 where he's talking so fast. It is because the intensity of what he's feeling. So when we looked at that, we looked at his spoken word performance, we noticed that there's really an architecture there. The beginning and the end are so much alike. Not only the repetition of certain verbs, basically he repeats the same thing: to hold on, to love loosely, so when it leaves, it won't exit so painfully. He repeats the reference to 6 feet tall, the use of rhyme at the beginning and at the end, but not in between. And in between that part there is where we notice that what we call that foregrounding, the heightened, the pain that he felt, the strength of his emotion came through at that point within the text. The text is building up to that point. There is an architecture to his text. There is an intention. You see, there can't really be a coherent architecture if there isn't an intention. And so intention is necessary, yes, in a work of art, but it's necessary in any kind of language. Again, I have taught students in terms of being able to think in terms of their architecture of the text and how it can be sort of mapped out. So again, this is an example of students writing where the student has then, again, on the right-hand side, explaining and illustrating the rhetorical structure of the text. I'm not going to go through and read it, but again, the point that is being made is that there has to be an intention, and that intention is going to be reflected in the way the text is structured. How each of the parts, how each of not just the sentences, but the sentences form parts. Finally, a text needs to be persuasive. How do you persuade? Not just in a motivational speech where Steve Jobs is trying to persuade them what action to take, or Susan Rice, or David Foster Wallace trying to persuade to how one thinks. Whatever writing you're doing, even within an academic context, it also, how does it persuade? And here again, some ideas to take away. The language. presents points and arguments, and how do you do it in an authoritative, impersonal, and objective way? Not by saying some people think. That only weakens what it is you're trying to say. But in fact, it is, how do you get your point across in a that cites authorities? Do you remember the piece that we looked at with Darwin's Origin of Species and Halliday's analysis? Remember how Darwin begins authorities. He begins with the voice of authorities before going on to express his view and the change from I to we. In terms of meaning, how does one get across how does one persuade? You need to be able to know how to evaluate what it is you're talking about. To put it across, you need to know what is valued within the discipline within which you are writing. How does it come across as relevant or valid or significant? You use authoritative sources to support your points. The writer includes and controls the voices of external sources to develop points and guide the reader towards a preferred position. Grammatically, how does this come across? Using what we call interpersonal objective metaphors, so that you can take what is your opinion, your recommendation, and say it like this: it is clear that, or there is a need for. You don't say I think, you don't say you should. Instead, you put it in more impersonal terms. You use source material incorporated throughout, citing those sources. This will be important when you write your term paper. I'm asking you to indicate the sources that validate the point that you're making about the text that you've chosen as being indeed an example of verbal art. I want you to show me, not just, I think this is a great piece of language. I want you to use authoritative sources that will make it more persuasive. So in this journal article, for example, questions remain. When you see that, what is the author doing? Questions remain, putting doubt into the reader's mind. But it is clear, the contrast on the one, in other words, taking one view and casting doubt on that view, but then coming back with the alternative view, but it is clear. Again, persuading, but indirectly. Okay, now that's basically all I wanted to cover with you today. What I wanted you to see, sort of, in this, we're almost to the end, and this is week 12. What I wanted you to sort of have a sense that what you've been hearing about and learning, and what you've been sort of realizing as far as an approach to understanding language and art, invention, inspiration, that these same notions about what it means to think grammatically and how intention is illustrated within the text and how we are persuaded. Well, the means by which we persuade in the language of science are, as we've seen, quotes authorities, to be indirect, to be impersonal. That, yes, would be different than in another context. Context matters. The purpose for which you are writing yes, in many ways will determine the choices that you are going to be making. You remember the rubric that I showed you at the beginning. You have the context, you have meaning, and then you have the grammar. The grammar is the realization of meaning within a context. And so what is that context? When we looked, for example, at the language of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump, we asked, is he speaking presidentially? And we found that sometimes he did, but many times no. But why? What was unpresidential about it? What was different? Why was it an alternative? In some ways, it's sort of like Trump's way of speaking within that context was sort of, again, like the anti-text, right? What was his purpose? He knew how to speak. We can see that in the speech to Congress. He could turn it on and he could turn it off. Why did he choose to speak the way he did in certain contexts? The choices that we're making. The choices have an intention. And they elicit a response. And that is the ability to persuade. Persuade one to one's point of view. That what you're saying is, as David Foster Wallace would say, capital T truth. So I want you to be thinking in terms of, and I hope that what you will come away with is the realization of the need to be A, grammatically aware, B, intentional, and 3, how to be persuasive. So that what you have an appreciation for is, yes, language and art, invention, inspiration, but understanding then how language as a resource makes it art, makes it inventive, makes it inspirational. Okay, so this is week 12. Week 13, I will just be reviewing with you, and that will be the close. I'm sorry for how today began with the difficulties in getting it, but I think we finally got ourselves turned around. And as I mentioned at the beginning, in case any of you were not here at the outset, the situation now is rather clear that if you are in Hong Kong, you do need to take the exam in person, face to face, on campus, and only available online is only available to those who are outside of Hong Kong. So as I understand, the university is rather strictly holding to this this policy. And I had thought perhaps one could apply for mitigation, but I was just told today that it only applies where there is a medical reason and medical certificate to back up if you are in Hong Kong, being able to do it online. So that is the only basis. All right. So I see that. Yes, from my understanding, and I asked about that and earlier today before class, because I was wondering about that myself. I don't know if all of you have seen it on the chat. We can use our laptop on campus. From my understanding, yes. I'll clarify that before next week. I was asking about that earlier from the department. From my understanding, what they replied to me was that yes, on campus, you will be able to use your laptop to be able to do it. Last semester, as I remember, that's how it was done. We had some students that came and did it in the venue itself, and they used their own computer. If you, we will have hard copy available as also in case you prefer to do that. The format of the exam will be as like the midterm. There will be 3 questions and you will choose one to answer. All right, so that will be similar to the midterm exam. Okay, are there any other questions before we close? Okay, if there are questions subsequently that you come to mind, and I wish you all well working with your term paper. And so I'll close it here. I'll be online for the next few minutes in case any of you have any questions. But for now, we'll end the lecture here.
Hello, Professor. I have one question.
Sure.
Can we use APA as citation format for the citation for term paper?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
APA, that's recommended, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So any other questions? Anybody have anything you would like to ask related to the exam or related to the term paper? Okay, now some questions are sent to me from, I won't mention your name in replying, but since you have asked the question, I think some of the questions that are asked would be relevant to others as well. So should I dedicate a paragraph on how it is highly valued? That will be, it's quite important. how highly valued? Yes, I mean, you will need to show through your sources why it's valued the way it is. I mean, for example, we've looked at various ways in which we've validated, for example, and today, let's just take today, the example of this is the commencement speeches. If I were looking for ways in which they were validated and highly valued, for example, if I were talking about David Foster Wallace, Time Magazine, what Time Magazine wrote, I mean, that would be very, very definitely interesting in terms of expressing from an outside source. You see, I'm trying to get you to look at outside sources as a way to back up what it is you are going to say about that text in terms of why it's valued the way it is. Why is it art? What makes it art? But I'm not wanting to hear only from your perspective. I want to hear also from you are citing authoritative sources to say so. So yes, I mean, you will, I think, need perhaps more than a paragraph to indicate how and why it is valued the way it is. Remind us on the exact date of the final exam. If you are indeed off campus, and again, I remind you, it needs to be because you are outside Hong Kong. Yes, you still need to have those 2 devices. All right, so that same practice as previously, you will be needing to do again. All right, to have two video, 2 cameras on you, and the exact date of the exam. I like to usually look that up. As far as I will put out an announcement, all right, on that. I have a date in my mind, but I just want to, I want to see it in print before I say it again. So my recollection is the 15th, but I'll confirm that with an announcement later, okay? And if you are dealing with a motivational speech which is from YouTube and a video, and do you need to have the script, I would perhaps not the script for the whole text, the whole video. Of course, you can get the transcript if the video has a transcript from YouTube. You could attach that as an appendix, but I assume that you would be including portions of it, at least within your essay, when you're going to be describing what was said and so forth. So it may not be the whole text. Please do provide the link. If you do have a transcript for the text, you could attach that as an appendix. That would be also quite useful. And okay, someone sent me an email, and I will read it after class. All right. Well, thank you very much for the comment about my lessons. In fact, I'm retiring after this semester, so this will be the last time I will be teaching this this course, and I've appreciated the opportunity to lecture, to share my interest in language with all of you, and I appreciate your attentiveness, and it's been a pleasure. Okay, I'm going to okay,